Opening the center, d4 immediately stakes a claim and invites a dynamic struggle for central influence, setting the stage for intricate positional maneuvering. Developing this knight immediately contests the center and opens avenues for piece activity. Claiming central space and preparing to expand on the queen side, setting a broad strategic stage for the middle game. Initiating fianchetto opens a diagonal for the bishop, aiming to pressure the center and control the dark squares. Undermining the central pawn structure for no apparent gain, f3 dangerously weakens the king's defense and concedes valuable central space. Developing a knight to a central square, the piece now eyes the d4 pawn and prepares to contest the center. Developing the knight to c3 shores up the center and prepares for kingside castling while offering flexibility. Unleashing the central pawn immediately challenges white's space and opens critical diagonals for the bishop pair. Boldly seizing central territory, white invites immediate confrontation, risking a weakened pawn structure for aggressive play. Instantly creating central pawn tension and opening lines, this capture forces white into a crucial decision regarding their pawn structure. Pushing the pawn aggressively seizes central space and forces black's knight to retreat, potentially disrupting its coordination and creating weaknesses on the dark squares around the black king. Repositioning the knight to the rim for an active outpost, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially attack the exposed e4 pawn, while also freeing up the f6 square for further development and adding pressure to the queen side. Embracing the central pawn vacuum, this capture decisively claims the open d-file, creating immediate pressure and preparing for a powerful kingside initiative, though it does concede a slight structural imbalance. Developing the bishop to g7 crystallizes black's fianchetto structure, preparing to exert pressure along the long diagonal and bolstering the kingside defenses after the pawn structure has been disrupted. Opening the knight to its natural square, white aims to develop his pieces actively and contest the central influence black has tried to build. This establishes a symmetrical piece structure, hinting at a potentially complex middle game where subtle pawn structure shifts and knight outpost creations will likely become decisive. Sacrificing a knight for a pawn after a pawn capture creates a curious imbalance, opening lines for your bishop and potentially disrupting white's pawn structure. The immediate gain is clear, but observe how this clears a path for your king's safety and future piece activity. Unleashing the king's pawn, white aims to dominate the center and disrupt black's pawn structure, creating a passed pawn on the g-file which might become a serious threat later. This aggressive pawn push opens lines and forces black to react, potentially sacrificing material for active counterplay or settling into a passive defense. The doubled f-pawns now offer a robust pawn chain, but also potentially weaken the king's immediate vicinity. Securing the monarch behind a pawn wall offers immediate safety, initiating a defensive maneuver to consolidate after the preceding exchanges. Asserting central influence and preparing to storm the kingside, this bishop repositions to a more active diagonal, aiming to harass black's castled monarch and control key squares. Its placement creates a subtle threat on the e4-g2 diagonal, potentially supporting future pawn advances or piece attacks. Unlocking the queenside diagonal for the bishop while offering a pawn sacrifice to disrupt white's central pawn structure. This move initiates a dynamic counterplay, aiming to exploit the temporarily weakened king's side pawn chain and seize the initiative. Pivoting the queen to the d2 square aims to solidify the kingside pawn structure, preventing potential immediate breakthroughs, and preparing for a later kingside assault or queenside expansion. Unleashing the central tension, black finally breaks open the d-file, aiming to liberate their cramped pieces and disrupt white's pawn structure. This bold capture forces white to decide whether to reclaim the pawn, potentially weakening their kingside further with the doubled f-pawns, or to maintain material balance at the cost of opening up the center for black's initiative. The resulting pawn structure will be crucial, with black hoping to exploit the open lines and white striving to consolidate their space advantage. Unlocking the c-file offers immediate attacking prospects, directly challenging black's pawn structure and potentially creating attacking lanes towards the king. Confronting the central pawn chain directly, black seeks to liberate their game by challenging white's strong d5 pawn, aiming to open lines for their pieces and potentially create weaknesses in white's kingside pawn structure. This pawn break, while aggressive, introduces complexities. If white captures on c6, their king's pawn shield becomes compromised. If they push forward, they create more tension and potential pawn islands. The ensuing fight will likely revolve around control of the now open c-file and the d4 square. Seizing the open file with the capture not only eliminates black's central pawn, but also opens up the g-file, potentially creating significant attacking chances for white's rook later. This aggressive pawn grab immediately disrupts black's pawn structure and creates immediate tactical possibilities. Unleashing the queen to the 7th rank immediately challenges the control of the d5 pawn, creating a dynamic tension that black hopes will disrupt white's developing structure. Castling queenside opens up the g-file for your rook and creates a formidable attacking spearhead, but it also leaves your monarch somewhat exposed on the flank, demanding immediate attention to reinforcing the pawn shield and developing the remaining pieces with purpose. Reclaiming the pawn opens up the b-file, promising active piece play for your rooks, while also creating some structural weaknesses around your king that white will immediately try to exploit. Shattering the calm, this queen sortie aims to disrupt black's nascent development and exploit the open d-file, immediately creating significant tension around the queenside and potentially forcing awkward king repositioning. Exchanging queens here initiates a stark positional showdown, prioritizing the material balance over immediate tactical fireworks and signaling an accelerated path toward the endgame, where pawn structure weaknesses on the queenside will become a significant concern for black. The rook now claims the open d-file, immediately threatening to penetrate black's position and creating significant pressure on the c6 pawn if it were to advance or be defended inadequately. Recognizing the weakened dark squares around the white king, black strategically develops the bishop to a square that prepares to harass the central pawn structure and potentially target the king's defense. Slamming the rook onto the c-file, white establishes an immediate, aggressive presence, intending to sever black's queenside development and potentially exploit weaknesses around the isolated pawns. This aggressive occupation, however, forces a sharp evaluation. Can white's king maintain its safety amidst this tactical tempest? Or is this bold rook sortie merely overextending and inviting a counterstrike from the black army? The knight's repositioning to d7, while seemingly passive, is a crucial defensive maneuver, subtly reinforcing the kingside and preparing for potential counterplay. Opening the f-file, a bold gamble designed to activate your rook and potentially storm the kingside, but it carves a lingering weakness along the diagonal pointed at your own monarch. Reclaiming the open c-file is paramount, and this maneuver firmly plants the rook, challenging white's control and aiming to exploit the eventual semi-open status of the file. The rook sacrifice on c8 decisively seizes control of the crucial open c-file, a critical nexus in this materially balanced, yet positionally strained, middle game. This audacious exchange fundamentally alters the pawn structure, forcing black into a passive defensive posture as their queen and remaining rook become disconnected pieces, struggling to coordinate against white's imminent central pawn push. The white king, though somewhat exposed, benefits from the newly opened lines that can be exploited for counterplay, while black's monarch, despite castling, now faces potential threats along the now clear diagonals. This aggressive pawn grab aims to exploit black's minor piece imbalance and create lasting structural weaknesses, paving the way for a powerful queenside initiative. Reclaiming the file is a priority, and while it opens lines for white's rook, it also establishes black's own major piece on a critical avenue, potentially setting up future pressure against white's weakened kingside pawn structure. Unleashing a targeted pawn raid, this maneuver instantly seizes control of the central files, creating a formidable barrier for black's pieces and subtly threatening to penetrate deeper into enemy territory. Bishop B repositioning is key now. Its relocation to the 7th rank offers increased pressure on the king's defenses and potentially prepares for future queen maneuvers across the back rank or even a targeted rook lift. Placing the king on the open d-file immediately brings it into the thick of potential action. A bold choice given the pawn structure's fractured nature and the ever-present rook on the c-file. A daring redeployment. The knight's journey to the queenside, a seemingly passive repositioning, actually aims to disrupt white's well-entrenched pawn chain and potentially exploit the suddenly exposed file should the rook abandon its post. This maneuver, while appearing to cede central control temporarily, sets a subtle trap, probing for weaknesses in white's pawn structure and offering new avenues for counterplay that weren't evident a moment ago. The bishop's repositioning to d3 now directly challenges the black knight's strong post on c5, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially win material. Clearing the central tension with this capture, black aims to simplify the pawn structure and potentially exploit the now open c-file for piece activity against white's somewhat exposed king. King now centralizes, stepping into the fray after a long slumber. The pawn structure, fractured by earlier exchanges, now presents both opportunity and peril for the monarchs. White's king, emerging from its shelter, aims to assert influence in the cramped central territory, seeking active participation rather than passive defense. This bold repositioning signals an aggressive endgame intention, where king activity becomes paramount. Observe how the displaced queens have simplified the position, setting the stage for a strategic battle of misplaced pieces and exploited weaknesses. The open files, once fiercely contested, now offer avenues for the kings to roam, but also expose them to potential counterplay if not carefully managed. This shift in king posture is crucial. It signifies a willingness to embrace tactical complications in pursuit of positional advantage, leveraging the remaining minor pieces to their fullest potential. Exchanging the bishop for the knight fundamentally alters the pawn structure and the nature of the ensuing endgame, aiming to simplify and exploit the isolated pawns. A bold recapture, gambling on the open files to compensate for the doubled pawns. A bold attempt to regain material, though it leaves your king exposed in this increasingly open terrain. A bold attempt to exploit black's slightly awkward bishop placement, aiming to activate the rook and challenge the queenside pawns. Black's bishop makes a daring diagonal dash, eyeing the exposed white king and forcing a king repositioning, while simultaneously aiming to disrupt white's fragile pawn structure and secure a more active role for the piece. The king's trek across the battlefield from safety to a forward post hints at a daring endgame gambit, sacrificing positional solidity for an aggressive kingside presence, although exposing the monarch to potential discovery threats along the newly opened diagonal. Controlling the central files becomes paramount now. This move subtly aims to prepare for potential piece activity on the queenside and may encourage the opponent to commit their remaining rook to a less active square. Opening up the f-file for your rook creates immediate attacking potential, threatening to break into black's position and potentially target their king once it's centralized. Gathering the king from the battlefield, the monarch seeks refuge behind a shield of pawns, preparing for a potential defensive stand or even a late-game counterattack. Asserting dominion over the open file, this rook immediately seeks to exploit the newly established pathway, aiming to pin down black's beleaguered bishop and disrupt any nascent counterplay emanating from the queenside. The bishop now retreats to a more active diagonal, eyeing the white pawn structure and preparing to support the advance of the pawn, aiming to disrupt white's cramped queenside and create dynamic play despite the material balance. Unleashing the king into the fray is a bold, albeit risky, gambit at this juncture, seeking active participation rather than passive defense. This maneuver seeks to mobilize the displaced king towards the queenside, aiming to contest control of the now open b-file and potentially shelter its monarch from the looming diagonal pressure of white's bishop. Probing for weaknesses, this pawn advance aims to create an outpost for the king on the kingside, potentially restricting black's pieces and opening lines for future pawn storms as the endgame approaches. Unlocking the c-file is the clear objective here, offering a vital pathway for the rook to potentially influence the center and create threats against white's somewhat exposed king. Shifting the rook to the kingside may seem curious after its recent tour of the queenside, but it's a proactive attempt to create attacking potential along the g-file, aiming to pry open the black king's defenses where it currently feels quite secure. Activating the king is paramount when the board clears, preparing for potential endgame battles or to participate in attacking maneuvers. Pushing the h-pawn here creates immediate tension on the king side, threatening to open lines that could prove crucial in the ensuing endgame, even as it sacrifices a bit of kingside pawn structure. Focusing on the bishop's active repositioning, this maneuver cleverly shifts the light-squared protector towards the king side, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially prepare an attack on the exposed monarch. Seizing the open file, white relentlessly pushes the pawn, aiming to create a passed threat and disrupt black's defensive structure. Re-engaging the bishop to a more active diagonal offers a subtle threat of disrupting white's pawn structure, though its current placement also sets up a potential trap if white miscalculates the king's safety. The unleashed pawn, empowered by its advance, now confronts black's king, seeking to disrupt its sanctuary and exploit the open diagonal. The black king, now dangerously exposed on the 7th rank, seeks refuge from the immediate threat of the advanced f-pawn and the bishop's pressure. Redirecting the rook to the central file aims to exert pressure on black's advanced king and exploit the potential weakness on the 7th rank, preparing to infiltrate if the black pieces become uncoordinated. A crucial decision point arrives, where the black king, a potential target, must navigate the treacherous landscape of the open files and the menacing white rook lurking on the d-file. Repositioning the rook to the open g-file presents a strategic regrouping, aiming to activate the piece behind the advancing f-pawn and potentially threaten squares around black's king. Rescuing the king from the dangerous open files and potential checks on the 1st rank is paramount here, though this maneuver also concedes valuable tempo to white's advancing pawns. Repositioning the rook to g2 aims to activate it along the 2nd rank, anticipating potential breakthroughs or offering defensive support for the f-pawn should it advance further. Reactivating the rook on the open e-file offers a chance to create dynamic play and perhaps disrupt white's pawn structure, while the king remains somewhat exposed. Reactivating the rook on the d-file offers flexibility, preparing to either support a pawn push with the f-pawn or potentially swing over to the king side if opportunities arise, a prudent choice given the current pawn structure and piece placement. The rook's relocation to the open d-file is a strategic repositioning, aiming to disrupt white's established pawn structure and contest crucial central territory. Fulfilling a vital role, this rook maneuvers to the 2nd rank, establishing an immediate threat against black's potentially vulnerable pawns and creating a crucial link for future pawn advancement. Circling the rook to its final resting place on c6 suggests a cautious consolidation, perhaps a regrouping before a more decisive maneuver, as the passed pawn on b7 looms large and white's king appears somewhat exposed. Injecting the bishop to the active e5 square aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, specifically targeting the c6 pawn and potentially opening lines for your rook on the d-file. Navigating towards the queenside rook seems like a strategic maneuver to consolidate the pieces and prepare for a potential breakthrough, but it leaves the king a tad exposed in the center. The bishop retreats to a more stable square, eyeing the central pawns and offering a passive defense while hoping to reroute its activity. Recognizing the stalemate potential of the opponent's pieces, this king's retreat signals a tactical adjustment, aiming to untangle the knight and prepare for a more active role in the unfolding, albeit currently static, queenside battle. Redirecting the rook to the 2nd rank provides crucial support for the f-pawn's advance, threatening to create a passed pawn and exploit the king's exposed position on the open diagonal. Repositioning the rook to the open d-file aims to contest control of this crucial pathway and potentially prepare for a maneuver towards the queenside, but it risks inviting further pawn advances from white that could restrict black's pieces. Reshaping the pawn structure with this advance creates immediate central pressure and aims to exploit the pinned knight on d6, potentially opening lines towards black's king or forcing further concessions. A bold decision to reroute the rook to contest the open file, aiming to disrupt white's attacking intentions on the king side and force a more defensive posture. The white monarch, having previously been the subject of some defensive maneuvering, now boldly steps into the fray, seeking to exploit the open central files and offer support to its beleaguered pawns in the endgame transition. The rook's repositioning to the king's flank signifies an attempt to build pressure, perhaps anticipating a pawn push or looking for tactical infiltration against the now exposed monarch. Bringing the rook back to the c-file aims to establish control over that open file, a crucial element in many endgames, while also preparing to potentially swing it over to the king's side if the opportunity arises to support a pawn push or a mating attack. Shifting the bishop to c6 is a subtle but important step, aiming to dislodge white's rook from the d-file and create a more active outpost for the piece. Shifting the king forward is a bold attempt to anchor the white pieces, hoping to shore up defenses and perhaps create some counterplay, though it risks exposing the monarch to the central pressure. The pawn chain on the king side is now quite fixed, and black's rook on the b-file is probing potential weaknesses, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure while simultaneously creating defensive counterplay. Unleashing the rook from its passive support role on the file, this maneuver aims to pressure black's pawn chain and potentially trap the bishop, creating active counterplay even in a seemingly balanced endgame. This square offers a safe haven for the rook, creating a potential outpost and preparing to challenge the open file with a pawn advance. The rook on d3 now eyes the open file, a potential point of pressure against black's somewhat exposed king. Sensing an opportunity, black injects dynamism into the position by advancing the pawn, challenging the white king's newfound central security and opening potential diagonal lines for the bishop. Unlocking the file for rook penetration offers a potential shift in initiative, seeking to disrupt black's coordinated defensive setup. Embracing the open files, your pawn advances, seeking to dislodge the entrenched bishop and create dynamism on the queen side. Grappling for initiative, white repositions the rook to a more active square, eyeing the g-file's potential for a breakthrough and challenging black's current setup. Exploiting the opened h-file offers a pathway to engage white's king, threatening to overwhelm its defenses and create mating possibilities. The king ventures forward, seeking an active role in the unfolding events and initiating a risky pawn push to potentially crack open black's defenses. Pushing the pawn forward seeks to create a passed pawn, potentially drawing the rook away from its defensive post on the g-file, but it also neglects the potential for white's king to advance further into black's territory and neglects consolidating the advantageous pawn structure on the king side. This relocation of the rook to the open file aims to exert pressure on black's queenside pawns and potentially create a passed pawn or exploit weaknesses. Finally, black brings the rook from the queenside to attack white's exposed pawn structure, seeking to create counterplay on the king side. Shifting the rook to this open file is a pragmatic attempt to exert some pressure on black's slightly exposed king, hoping to create counterplay or perhaps even provoke a mistake in the ensuing pawn race. Instigating a pawn storm on the queenside with this advance aims to create a dynamic push, seeking to unravel white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for the rook, while simultaneously limiting the scope of white's king and pawns. Initiating a decisive kingside assault, this check forces black's monarch into a precarious square, potentially setting up a powerful discovered attack or a mating net. Sacrificing material to activate the king into the heart of the enemy's defenses, aiming for a swift checkmate or decisive material gained through overwhelming positional pressure. The pawn's advance to e6 rips open the position, creating a crucial outpost for the rook and directly challenging black's beleaguered king by threatening to escort the pawn to promotion. The rook on a1 is now thoroughly trapped, a testament to the clever pawn push that created this cage. This unexpected pawn advance injects a fascinating tension, forcing black to reevaluate how to contain the rapidly advancing passer, especially given the precarious placement of his rook and the exposed nature of his king. The promotion is inevitable now, and the pawn's journey to the 8th rank completes a dramatic strategic shift, forcing white into a defensive posture as the newly crowned queen joins the fray. Capturing the pawn with the bishop solidifies control over the file and prepares for a potential infiltration or a strategic repositioning of the rook to a more active square. The queen's sacrifice, though forced to stop the pawn's unstoppable march, now leaves black with significantly less material and a very exposed king. The promotion of the pawn to a queen is imminent, forcing immediate attention to the e-file's fate. A desperate attempt to stir up complications by shoving the rook into white's monarch, hoping for a stalemate or a quick checkmate, but the advanced pawn on e7 and the well-supported king make this a futile gesture. Activating the monarch presents a stark tactical challenge, as the king bravely ventures into the fray to assist its forces. The king, exposed and vulnerable on the light squares, faces immediate danger as the rook crashes in, seeking out its desperate flight path. The king retreats, seeking refuge behind the remaining pawns as the rook on the second rank eyes potential entry points. Black is preparing a surprise with this pawn sacrifice, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain and open up lines towards the king. The rook now retreats, seeking a more active role on the second rank, aiming to support the pawn's advance towards promotion and create potential mating threats by coordinating with the king. The rook's retreat to e1 prepares to defend the seventh rank, creating a blockade against white's advancing pawn while keeping a watchful eye on the central squares, and potentially offering support for a future kingside maneuver if the opportunity arises. The monarch, having steered clear of the active rook on the first rank, now aims for the relative safety of the d-file, a crucial artery in this rook and pawn struggle. The rook retreats, seeking safety behind the pawn chain, acknowledging that direct confrontation on the open files has become too risky with the opposing king now more actively positioned. The rook's retreat to b3 liberates the file, preparing for a potential pawn push to the seventh rank and a queen promotion with the support of the remaining pawns. The king, now liberated from its protective pawn shield, bravely ventures out, seeking to participate in the crucial fight on the queen side and potentially exploit weaknesses in white's less-than-ideal pawn structure. Asserting control over the open file, the rook aims to disrupt black's coordination and create threats on the king side, potentially forcing concessions or opening lines for further attack. Unleashing the rook's power after a sequence of pawn pushes, this surprising check forces white's king to a more exposed square, a precarious position given the remaining material and the proximity of the black king. Shifting the monarch towards the king side offers little safety, but attempts to maintain a potential defensive perimeter against black's aggressive pawn storm. The unleashed pawn's advance presents a tantalizing, albeit risky, path to promotion, potentially disrupting white's coordinated pieces and forcing a desperate defense. Securing the seventh rank is paramount. The rook's repositioning ensures it dominates the only open file, preventing any immediate counterplay from black's rooks and setting up a potential advance of the e-pawn. The rook retreat to the sixth rank aims to regroup and defend the vulnerable pawn chain, though it relinquishes control of the open file and allows white's king a safer harbor.